The world of royalty often hides its sharpest stories in the shadows of polished crowns. Tales of political marriages, secret alliances, and hushed scandals blur the line between myth and monarchy. But few stories whisper quite so strangely, so quietly, and so confidently into history as the one you're about to hear. A queen, a child bride, a marriage to her own uncle, and a court that didn't bat an eye. A name few know, a story few forget. Her name was Juana of Castile, not the mad queen, but the young one, the quiet one, sometimes confused in history books, often forgotten. But her life would be shaped by a union that modern ears might find unthinkable, and yet, in her time, barely stirred the surface. Juana, born into the royal house of Trastamara, was never expected to rule. But in a world where bloodlines were as sacred as holy relics, her destiny was already set before she took her first steps. What mattered most was not her education, her charm, or her talents. It was her lineage, and how that lineage could be managed. The world she inherited. Juana was born in 1373, in a Castile court between war and politics. The Reconquista still burned in the south. France and England fought their endless 100 Years' War to the north. Within the peninsula itself, kingdoms shifted like sand under siege. Leon, Aragon, Navarre, Castile. To rule meant to marry. To marry meant to secure. She was the daughter of King Henry II of Castile, a monarch who had clawed his way to the throne through rebellion and bloodshed. A king whose own legitimacy was questioned. A king who needed his heirs to keep the peace he had barely won. Juana's mother was Juana Manuel of Villena, herself a descendant of royalty and nobility on both sides. The blood in Juana's veins was the kind that mattered most, interwoven, ancient, pure, a child among thrones. From the moment she could walk, Juana was trained not to question, but to obey. She learned to speak carefully, bow lower than others, and keep her eyes down when addressed by men of the court. She was taught how to receive a gift, how to kneel in prayer, and how to keep secrets. While other children played, Juana stood beside her mother in court, absorbing the ceremonies like sunlight through stained glass. At the age of 6, she was already being considered for marriage, but not to a foreign prince, not to a stranger. The court had other plans. Why blood meant everything. In medieval Europe, family was not just important, it was sacred strategy. Kings and queens married their cousins, their nieces, their half-siblings, because outside blood meant outside claims. And Juana? Juana was betrothed to her own uncle, King John I of Castile, the younger brother of her deceased father. It was not seen as strange, it was seen as smart. By marrying Juana to her uncle, the house of Trastamara could consolidate its power. The bloodline remained untouched by foreign influence. Rival claims would weaken, enemies would think twice. The Pope granted a dispensation. The people barely whispered. And history took another strange, deliberate step, the marriage that shocked no one. In 1379, when Juana was only 6 years old, she was married by proxy to King John. He was 24. She was barely out of infancy, but that didn't matter. What mattered was what she represented. Legitimacy, stability, the binding of two royal lines into one seamless knot. Their formal wedding would not be celebrated until years later. By then, Juana would be old enough to stand beside her husband, not as his niece, but as his queen. The court celebrated. The kingdom carried on. No protests, no scandals. In a world built on blood and power, love was irrelevant, and scandal was relative. What comes next? Juana's story doesn't end here. Her role in Castilian history would stretch far beyond her childhood marriage. She would become mother to kings. She would see wars and treaties. She would walk the fine edge between ceremony and silence. But at the root of it all was that strange, quiet wedding. A queen, still a child, joined to her uncle, and a world that looked, nodded once, and moved on. Because in the 14th century, dynasty was destiny. By the time Juana of Castile was 10 years old, she was already a wife. Not in the way we understand it today, not yet, but in the eyes of the court, the church, and the law, her destiny was sealed. She belonged to King John I, her uncle, and Castile watched her transformation with the indifference of a world where queens were born to serve dynasties, not themselves. Living among stone and ceremony, Juana grew up in palaces that were more fortress than fairy tale. Thick stone walls kept out the world, and often warmth. The halls were cold in winter, damp in spring, and echoing always. She learned to walk slowly and speak softly, to curtsy at the right depth, to lower her eyes in reverence, to dress in layered silks, weighed down by brocade and embroidery, garments chosen less for comfort and more for symbol. Every morning, a servant brushed her hair, wound ribbons through it, and fixed it into elaborate braids fit for a queen in training. And every evening, she was reminded, gently, then firmly, that she was being watched. Because everything a queen does is a message. Court life, always watched, never heard. Life inside the palace was a delicate ballet of appearances. Juana was surrounded at all times by ladies-in-waiting, some only a few years older than her. They served as companions, but also as informants, reporting back to her mother, or to her uncle husband, or to members of the court. She was not allowed to play as other children might. Games were considered frivolous, unless they taught grace, restraint, or religion. She practiced needlework, copied psalms, and learned French and Latin, not to express herself, but to correspond with foreign courts and priests. Her education was not for curiosity, it was for utility, raised by ritual. Much of Juana's day revolved around religion. Mass at dawn, prayer before meals, evening vespers, confession at week's end. She was taught that obedience to God meant obedience to her husband, that virtue in a queen was silence, modesty, and fertility. The church had approved her marriage to her uncle, an act which raised no outcry because dynastic marriages were common, and the papal dispensations flowed like ink across royal scrolls. To challenge the union was to challenge the kingdom, and no one dared do that. The royal womb. As Juana approached her early teens, her role shifted from symbolic to biological. She was no longer just the niece wife. She was now the future mother of Castile. At age 12, it was expected that her marriage to King John would be consummated. There was no ceremony, no announcement, only the quiet assumption that the alliance must now bear fruit. The court watched her belly. Midwives hovered. Advisors whispered about her cycles. In a world where queens were judged not by speeches but by sons, Juana's greatest test was just beginning. And in 1382, when she was still only a child by any modern measure, she gave birth to her first child, Henry, mother of a king-to-be. The birth of a son secured her place, not as a woman, not as a partner, but as a vessel of legitimacy. The baby was healthy, male, royal, and the court rejoiced, not for Juana, but for the future of the dynasty. The people referred to her more often now as Queen Juana, no longer just the daughter of Henry II or the niece of King John. She was the mother of the heir, a living seal on the royal bloodline. She had done her duty, her silence, her strength. Through it all, Juana spoke little, in the historical record. She left behind no bold proclamations, no letters that shook the order of things, but in the shadows of royal halls, in the margins of Latin chronicles, her presence lingers. A queen who obeyed, a bride who submitted, a girl who became a mother before she became a woman. Her quietness was not weakness. It was the armor she wore to survive a court that required women to be symbols, not people. And in the end, it worked, because Juana endured. By the time Queen Juana of Castile turned 14, she had already done what many queens never would. She had borne a male heir. She had secured a throne, and she had survived. Now, as a young mother and wife to her uncle, King John I, her life became one of waiting, always watching the tides of politics shift, just outside her reach. She was still queen, still consort, but the court had no need for her opinions. What they needed was her presence, her dignity, and the stability her silence represented. The 100 Years' War reaches Iberia. Though Castile sat south of the brutal wars between France and England, the ripples of that conflict reached even Juana's world. King John I aligned with France, hoping to strengthen his claim and reinforce Castilian independence from English influence. This meant preparing for battle, forging alliances, and negotiating marriages, one of the few currencies more powerful than coin. And where was Juana in all of this? At court, in the background, always present, never deciding. She watched foreign envoys arrive with scrolls and seals. She heard whispers of betrothals being planned for children not yet weaned. She listened, quietly, as her own son's future was carved into treaties he would not read for years. A kingdom in motion, a queen at rest. The king traveled often, inspecting his holdings, meeting with nobles, and maintaining order in the outer provinces. Juana remained behind, in Segovia or Toledo, two royal strongholds where the court gathered in splendor and secrecy. She attended public mass. She received gifts from noblewomen. She embroidered tapestries. She trained her son in courtly behavior. She did not command armies. She did not write decrees. But her stillness was not passivity. It was presence. She was the visual reminder of the crown's strength, of its continuity, of its divine right. The plague returns. But not even royal halls could keep out the black wind that blew from the east. In the early 1390s, the Black Death returned, sparser than the first wave in the 1340s, but no less terrifying. Markets emptied. Villages locked their gates. Clergy disappeared. And in the city squares, fires were lit, not for warmth, but to cleanse the air. At court, the queen was surrounded by priests and physicians, burning incense and performing ritual protections. Doors were shut. Letters were sealed in vinegar. Her children were moved to country estates for safety. But Juana remained in the palace, not because she was braver than others, but because a queen could not flee from fear. She had to sit beside it, hands folded, eyes calm. A crown's burden. While John and I managed campaigns and court affairs, Juana watched Castile from behind the veil of ceremony. In letters, now lost but referenced by later scribes, the king praised her composure, her modesty, her faithfulness. She was not expected to be political. She was expected to endure. And so, day by day, she built her reputation not as a bold ruler, but as a pillar, unmoving, unyielding, unbroken, even as sickness knocked at the palace gates, even as power passed her by. A future already chosen. Juana's son, Prince Henry, now growing tall and solemn like his father, was groomed from birth to be king. He had tutors in history, law, and Latin. He was trained in swordplay, falconry, and diplomacy. And all the while, his mother stood beside him at mass, at feast, at coronation ceremonies, not speaking for him, but standing for him. In a court built on image, Juana was the perfect silhouette, silent, regal, holy. And though the world outside shifted, with wars, disease, and rebellions inside the palace walls, she held the center. A queen who waited. As the 1390s neared their end, King John grew restless, and so did the kingdom. New battles brewed on the borders. Succession had to be secured. The nobility grew anxious. And then, in 1390, while riding in preparation for a military expedition, King John I fell from his horse. He died days later, unexpectedly, abruptly, violently. He was only 32. Juana, his wife, his niece, the quiet girl who had been given to him in marriage before she could write her own name, was left behind, a widow at 17, a queen mother in a kingdom bracing for instability. And still, she did not weep in public. She did not waver. She stood, because that's what queens did. At just 17 years old, Queen Juana of Castile found herself in a new role. Not just queen consort, but queen dowager. Widowed young, the same court that once watched her as a girl bride now turned to her with wary curiosity. Would she remarry? Would she fade into the background? Would she claim power? Juana chose none of these. Instead, she stepped gracefully, firmly, into the role that history had been preparing her for all along, the guardian of the next king, the boy who inherited a crown. Her son, Henry III, was only 11 when his father, King John I, died from that sudden fall, too young to rule in his own right, too young to understand the fragile politics swirling through Castile's nobility. A council of regents was formed, powerful men of the court, each eager to influence the boy. But none of them could replace Juana. She was his mother, his protector, his living link to 2 generations of monarchs. And in the eyes of the people, her presence beside the young king added a sense of order in uncertain times. The silent power of a Queen Mother Juana never made public speeches. She never led troops. She never signed treaties. But within the palace, her influence was unmistakable. She oversaw her son's daily lessons, his court etiquette, his introductions to bishops, ambassadors, and nobles. She taught him the delicate skill of listening without speaking, and of speaking only when necessary, a rule she had lived by herself for most of her life. Juana also ensured that Henry remained connected to faith and tradition, guiding him to become not just a strong king, but a respected one. And as the years passed, Henry began to embody everything the kingdom needed in a ruler: measured, pious, calm, a reflection, perhaps, of the woman who raised him. Letters and shadows, though few records survive bearing Juana's own hand, we know from contemporaneous accounts that she remained active in court life. Chroniclers described her as quiet in voice, but firm in bearing. She received foreign envoys when her son was ill. She managed estates in her own name. She maintained correspondence with convents and churches across the realm. And yet, she never overstepped. In a time when noblewomen were accused of plotting or overreaching, Juana never gave her enemies reason to whisper. She was always just one step behind the throne, visible enough to be revered, distant enough to be safe. A woman apart. Juana wore mourning for years after her husband's death. Black velvet, grey wools, subdued colors that marked her as set apart, untouched by courtly flirtation or remarriage. Suitors came and went, offers were made, but she refused them all. Perhaps it was duty, perhaps it was devotion, Or perhaps, after being married off as a child, Juana had tasted enough of marriage to know she did not want it again. She found solace in religion, spending long hours in chapels, commissioning prayers, and donating to monastic orders. She became a patroness of the quiet life she was never allowed to live, the queen who never raised her voice. History remembers queens who plotted, queens who rode into battle, queens who shouted in parliament and scrawled their wills in blood. Juana was none of these. She didn't need to be. Her influence came not from drama or defiance, but from presence. She knew how to stand still when others trembled, how to appear calm when the court was in chaos, how to keep her son grounded when the nobles circled like wolves. In a world where power often shouted, Juana whispered, and still she was heard, a dynasty secured. By the time Henry III reached adulthood, Castile was stable once again. He would go on to rule wisely and cautiously, earning the nickname Henry the Sufferer for his long illnesses, but also Henry the Noble for his even hand. And behind every royal audience, every decree, every ceremonial robe, the quiet memory of his mother lingered. Juana had ensured not only the crown's survival, but its dignity. History tends to favor noise, the declarations of war, the clash of swords, the fiery speeches and fateful betrayals. But sometimes, what endures is not the thunder, but the stillness that follows it. And so it was with Queen Juana of Castile. No battles bear her name, no towers were built in her honor, no scandals marked her twilight years. But what she left behind shaped a dynasty, and more importantly, defined a model of royal womanhood that echoed through generations. She did not write her story, but others did. Juana herself left behind almost no writing, no memoirs, no declarations, no dramatic final letters from a cold bedchamber. But her name appears in monastic records, in the ledgers of court, and in the accounts of chroniclers, often briefly, always respectfully. Words used to describe her: pious, grave, virtuous, silent. To the medieval mind, these were not dull traits. They were the marks of a perfect queen. In a time when women who spoke too freely were dismissed or feared, Juana's silence made her untouchable, and from that silence, a reputation of stability was born. A mother of kings, Juana's son, Henry III, ruled Castile from 1390 to 1406. Though often ill, he was known for his restraint, moderation, and emphasis on royal justice. He worked to curb the excesses of the nobility and strengthen royal authority, without brutality. Many historians have remarked how unusual his temperament was, especially compared to the fiery monarchs around him. But perhaps it wasn't so unusual after all. He had been raised not by warlords or courtiers, but by a quiet, watchful queen who understood the power of holding her tongue and ruling from the margins. Henry's reign reflected that same calm, and it changed the course of Castilian monarchy, a model of queenship. After Juana, the role of Queen Mother in Castile became more clearly defined. She set a precedent, not just in how to survive court intrigue, but how to outlast it. Future queens would reference her behavior in the courtly manuals. Confessors and tutors would hold her life up as an example to daughters of the nobility. She had married her uncle. She had ruled without ruling. She had never caused scandal. And yet her presence had anchored an entire kingdom. That quiet strength became a kind of blueprint for queens across Iberia. Her final years, Juana spent the last 2 decades of her life in relative peace. No longer a girl queen, no longer a mother guardian. She became what many noble women did in their later years, a patroness of the church. She funded monasteries, She sponsored prayers for the souls of kings past. She maintained correspondence with abbots and bishops, especially those who supported education and the poor. There are no dramatic records of her death. She passed away quietly, likely in the late 1410s, though the exact year remains unclear. There was no grand funeral procession recorded, no statues raised, just candles lit, masses said, and her name spoken softly in chapel prayers for royal souls, a legacy in the shadows. Even today, portraits of Juana are hard to find. She is sometimes mistaken for other queens of her era, her name eclipsed by louder rulers, grander scandals, more quotable queens. But in the background of Castilian history, she remains, not as a footnote, not as a symbol of scandal, but as a woman who played the role she was given flawlessly. In a time when queens were pawns, Juana found a way to be something more, a foundation. And like any foundation, she was not always visible, but nothing stood without her. Modern eyes recoil. A girl married her uncle. She was 6. He was 24. In today's world, that fact alone would cause outrage, scandal, protest. It would dominate headlines and documentaries. It would be dissected by scholars and condemned by the public. But in the 14th century, no one blinked. Royal blood, the ultimate currency. To understand how this happened, not just how it was allowed, but how it was expected, we must return to a central truth of medieval monarchy. Blood was power. The more royal blood one possessed, the more legitimate one's claim to rule. Marrying outside the nobility was not just frowned upon, it was dangerous. And so, families married within themselves, cousins, half-siblings, nieces, and uncles, not because they lacked options, but because they feared losing dynastic control. To outsiders, it was unnatural. To those within the court, it was strategy. Juana and John's marriage wasn't an accident. It was a blueprint, papal permission, the rubber stamp of royal sin. Even in the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church forbade marriages between close kin, at least in theory. But monarchs had access to something no peasant ever could: papal dispensations. A king would simply write to the Pope, outlining the political necessity of a marriage. In return, the Pope, often under political pressure himself, would grant permission. Sometimes these dispensations were granted after the marriage had already taken place. Sometimes they were retroactive or conveniently backdated. The union of Juana and her uncle, King John I, stamped, approved, blessed, not because it was holy, but because it was useful. Silence as consent. What did the court say? The nobles, the clergy, the people? Almost nothing. There are no recorded objections, no sermons denouncing the union, no uprisings, no scandals. Even the chroniclers, the medieval equivalent of reporters, barely mention the matter. Why? Because to question the marriage was to question the legitimacy of the crown. To protest was to threaten the inheritance of the next king. And in a world where rebellion was met with exile, torture, or death, silence was more than survival. It was loyalty. A family web, not a tree. To look at the genealogy of Castile in the 14th century is to look at a loop, not a line. Juana's own parents were both descendants of the royal house. Her husband was her father's brother, yes, but also her political guardian, her protector, her doorway to queenship. And this wasn't unique. In England, Spain, France, the Habsburg Empire, and even the Byzantine court, inbreeding among royalty was the norm. Not an aberration, not an accident. It was a design, a way to consolidate power, concentrate wealth, and keep enemies outside the castle walls. What it meant then, and what it means now. To call Juana's story a scandal is to apply modern values to a medieval world. But that's not what this video is about. This isn't an expose. It's not outrage. It's not judgment. It's a quiet look at a moment in time. A time when girls became queens before they knew what marriage was. When uncles became husbands without flinching. When silence covered discomfort like snow over a grave. And when a queen could be remembered not for her marriage, but for her stillness, her steadiness, and the son she raised to rule in her place. What we're left with Juana's life, viewed through modern eyes, might seem tragic, might seem strange, might seem wrong. But in the world she knew, she succeeded, she secured the throne, she preserved peace, she left behind no war, no scandal, no chaos. And maybe that's why no one blinked. Because in a court full of ambition and noise, Juana whispered, and history listened, softly,